welcome to Art Mirrors Futures, a video blog about art and mirrors and a little bit about the futures. Time for the next interesting story. Today's story is indeed a new one. It is slightly different from the previous stories I told so far. Those ones were more or less reading over. I researched them earlier, I prepared them before. They were ready text, ready posting in my blog, so the task was just to kind of voice over. This story is different. I actually discovered or sort of explored it during last week, so it was already prepared for this blog specifically. And so despite all the challenges, I cannot travel, so the majority of the pictures I will be using are not mine. I found them somewhere in the internet, or using, for example, Google Maps to virtually travel into different locations. Yeah, for example, this story starts in Milano. So what you see is, of course, the picture of the famous Milan Cathedral, Milan Duomo, which is emblematic for the city. I haven't been to Milan yet, and unfortunately, because of the current kind of situation, it's not quite clear when we will be able to travel. I hope one day soon. So ideally, I'd like to visit this places, of course, myself. Some of them I did, some of them I haven't yet. But anyway, the story is not about the Milan Cathedral. This story starts in a different church, so-called famous Basilica of St George. It's a very old church. It was constructed and reconstructed many times. A typical Roman architecture. The story is not so much about church, but about one specific chapel or capella, known as Cappella Portinari. So what you see here in this picture is the Google map image of this church. The exterior of this capella, of this chapel, is interesting, but perhaps nothing very remarkable. However, its interior is considered to be really a beautiful example of the Florence architecture, Florentine style in Milano. It's one of the earliest examples when the famous style of Florence was brought to Milano. The issue here is that the commissioner of this chapel, so-called Cappella Portinari, was born in Florence, but then he lived most of his life in Milan, where he was representative of the famous Medici Bank. So he was a banker basically, and very rich, very respected member of society. Therefore, he was in a position to commission this chapel, which became kind of a additional part of this famous basilica. You see here the examples of the interiors. It's very, very richly decorated. For example, I found the example of this ceiling or dome of this chapel, really magnificent, kind of 3D or circular rainbow. I guess it's a fresco, although it looks like a mosaic. Interestingly enough, the name of Portinari is known in art, in the history of art, and specifically of Flemish art, but mainly because of his brother Tommaso. What you see here is, for example, his famous portrait created by Hans Memling, and him and his wife Mary. He also commissioned a number of other artworks, including the famous triptychs and altarpieces. Besides the frescoes, which are beautiful, I'm mostly interested in this monument, which is visibly a tomb. This chapel today is mainly known because of this famous tomb. It's a tomb of Peter of Verona, or Peter the Martyr, one of the saints of Catholic Church. I'm not sure it's very, very famous, although locally he is very known. He is considered to be a patron of Milan, so he is very, very famous locally. He lived in the middle of 13th century. I don't want to go to be very blasphemous, but although his life is really controversial, at the end of his life he was appointed to be inquisitor of Catholic Church, and he was in charge of prosecution of Cathars. Cathars are very famous heresy, very widespread in France, but it's mainly known through France. So it's French branches, but it actually apparently was also very popular in the north of Italy. According to the his story of his life, he was killed by Catars in a forest not far from Milan. Therefore, his traditional iconography, he's depicted with whatever axe or sword in his head, and there are a number of artworks depicting this scene of him being killed in this forest. This tomb is also depicting the scenes of his life on the upper rim of this tomb, including the scenes of him being killed in this forest. These reliefs are considered to be beautiful examples of early Italian sculpture, but of course I'm mostly interested in the different sculptures of this tomb. These are the pillars that this sarcophag is placed on. There's 4 sculptures of women, which are obviously the virtues. As you could guess from my previous story, I'm mostly interested in one, which is you see to the right, to the very right of you. That's a figure of Prudence. Similar to the previous depictions, she's holding a mirror in her right hand. She's also holding a book. It's not very visible on this version, but the next version, which is kind of the view on this tomb from the side, you can see now that there are in total 8 columns, or 8 pillars, 4 cardinal virtues in front, and I'm not sure who was the 8th. The 3 others should be Christian virtues. I didn't find the picture of the rear row of the columns. But if we talk about Prudence, this picture allows us to see better that Prudence has 2 faces, which again we've seen before. But other picture, the next one, show that she has not 2 but 3 faces, and that's a very interesting feature I've never seen before, and that's a kind of feature, that's a kind of way of depiction Prudence I will get interested in, and basically this story will be about this kind of sculptures or examples. So basically entire story will be about this particular case of Prudence with 3 heads, why, who started, why, and why it was popular. Basically the number of questions, who and why I got interested. I've never seen it before, and then I just wanted to kind of figure out who started this tradition and so on. So basically I don't have any pictures of any of those sculptures or monuments I will be showing today. So what you see here, kind of this supporting infavis, is just example of the other church interiors. So fundamentally will be about interiors and sculptures and entombments in churches. Interestingly, but once in my life I actually had the chance to see an example of such a 3-headed Prudence. It was a couple of years ago when I visited Jeffhof, a very famous fair of art and antiquities in Maastricht. Again, a victim of this epidemic too. This year there was half cancelled halfway. But in any case, I've seen this sculpture. As you see, it's just kind of a fragment of the sculpture with on this particular image you could see 2 heads, but the next one shows 2 other heads. And again, if I would use this sort of combination or collage, you could see here the sculpture with 3 heads. 2 of them are women, and 1 is a kind of old man. And the sculpture was described as Prudence. Back then I was puzzled, but it was for me like one-off examples, strange ones. And much later I also found another example that's in a collection of Met in New York. This particular image allows to see the 3 heads simultaneously. But even despite that, museum mainly suggests to see different sort of version of the picture from different sides, and this collage allows you to see the sort of the 3 heads of this figure. Again, it was described as Prudence, but no any other details of the sculpture survived. So as I said, this particular story today will be about this kind of a depiction of Prudence with 3 heads. So if I go back to this tomb, the interesting one, which I forgot to mention, the capella was commissioned. The capella itself was commissioned in the middle of 15th century, in 1460. However, the tomb itself was created much earlier. It was initially placed in the basilica itself. It was created around 1335 or 36 by famous architects or famous sculptor of this time, known as Giovanni di Balduccio. And to understand, again, in an effort to understand where and how he could pick up this particular way of depicting Prudence, we need to go to another Italian city, Pisa. Why Pisa? Well, it is considered that Giovanni di Balduccio was trained in Pisa. He was born in Pisa, and then according to some stories, according to some sources, he got a training from very famous architect and sculptor from Pisa, Giovanni of Pisano, or Giovanni Pisano. What you see here are, of course, the very famous Pisa Tower, Leaning Tower of Pisa, and of course, famous Cathedral of Pisa, a wonderful, brilliant example of both architecture and interiors. To my taste, the kind of current placement is a bit bizarre. They're located like a zoo in this strange green lawn, outside of any particular context. But nevertheless, it's not my point to comment on this. It's still, the cathedral remains to be a beautiful example of both architecture and interior. The picture from interior, I've been to this cathedral myself, but it's not always possible to take good pictures. It's a really mind-blowing experience when you enter this sort of, it's a huge, very complex, excessively decorated by multiple layers of frescoes and figures and paintings and so on. It was like for centuries of work of layering this kind of monument. This is not my picture. I found it much later. It's sort of 3D panorama, a virtual panorama of the cathedral. As you can see, it's really mind-blowing, kind of really dizzying when you're basically walking through the spaces with your heads gazing on the ceilings. And yeah, as excuse, I can say you can see here an example of one picture I found with a mirror. It's of course Prudence, also with a more classical Prudence holding a mirror and holding a snake. And then I found this in one of the sort of frescoes of this cathedral. Well, it's not exactly the one I will be talking about, but still showing that I've been there. I've seen this structure too. That's a famous pulpit. Pulpit are known in Catholic tradition. Basically, this is a place where the priest was reading the book or any other message to the congregation. And then you can see here the place where the book, for example, would be placed. In this particular case, the stairs didn't survive. Pulpit was reconstructed, demolished at some point, then reconstructed again. So we don't know actually even exactly if the order of the columns is the same. Some of these are virtues, and I've been there. I took the pictures of some of these sculptures. For example, this famous, apparently one of the earliest examples of the depicting of the nude figure. In this case is, well, again, different versions say it's either Adam or Heracles, or even maybe the attribute or one of the virtues of fortitude. And then this Eva, for example, these pictures I took, but I didn't take the picture of that one. It's one of those smaller figures. Big sculptures, they also place on groups of smaller ones, so this belongs to smaller ones. And I believe it's also depicting the Prudence. One of those sculptures are Justice with scales and sword, and another one is Prudence. Although in this case she doesn't hold any mirrors and snake, and so forth, I completely missed it back then, so it's not even my picture. So she's holding cornucopia and also a compass. Back then I didn't know the concept that well, so I kind of skipped it. Giovanni Pisano was a member of a very, very famous Italian family of sculptors and architects. He's especially, because of his father Niccolo Pisano, even more famous architect who was basically a founder of the whole school of Italian sculpture and architecture. This, for example, the book about their pulpits. And among many other things, they also created a whole range of those famous pulpits. In fact, one of them could be found not that far from the one in the Cathedral of Pisa. It's this one is in baptistry of Pisa, basically the construction, just standing next to the cathedral, and this was done by Niccolo Pisano, the father and the founder of this artistic family. It's kind of comparable structure. It's also kind of the upper layer standing on a columns. It's much more simple. It's less columns and also less decorated columns, but it was already a beginning of quite a distinctive style. The next one in Siena Cathedral, they created already together. So to create this one, his son Giovanni already was helping him. This particular one also allows to see the stairs. In this case, they survived, and behind this pulpit, you could see the stairs that were used by the priest to climb to this construction. And the third one is a pulpit created already by Giovanni Pisano himself. It's in Pistoia. Again, much more simple constructions, well, basically resembling the pattern. The upper layer standing on the columns, but much more simple columns. And as you could see, none of those neither columns nor the reliefs has any figures of Prudence. Definitely not a Prudence with mirror or with 2 or 3 heads. If I would be able, I would go there and maybe have had a second look, because it's not always easy to find the pictures depicting those monuments from different positions, and sometimes it could be a very small figure. But nevertheless, so far, I can say it was a bit of a dead end. I just checking the works of the teachers of or trainers of the Giovanni di Balduccio, I didn't find anything resembling the 3-headed Prudence. I tried to also look at other works created by this artistic family. For example, I found this fountain in Perugia, but the picture from Google Maps shows the current situation as as typical for Italy. You could see the structure in city context, and of course, as often happened with Italy, is under reconstruction. Well, at least I have some pictures without reconstruction, but in any case, there are very, very few good pictures of depicting all these multiple sculptures and figures of this fountain. I found one that may look like Prudence. It's a lady sitting, she's holding cornucopia, maybe Prudence, maybe also actually the other metaphor of abundance, which is a very different story. So basically, again, just confirming, a bit of a dead end. I didn't find any follow-ups, any sort of prequels behind the 3-headed figure of Prudence by Balduccio. I actually had more luck in another Italian city, in Florence. What you see here is a very famous corner of Florence, perhaps the most famous sort of intersection of it's a Florence Cathedral, Duomo, and of course Campanile. It's a belfry of the cathedral, and then the baptistry. They're standing just next to each other. Why Florence? Because apparently, according to other sources, the trainer or the teacher of Giovanni di Balduccio was Andrea Pisano. He was born in Pisa, but he basically worked and lived most of his life in Florence, and he was working initially in the workshop of Giotto, and then he became also himself a very famous architect. In fact, he is mostly known not as a sculptor, but as a metal worker. For example, what you see here, it's 3 famous doors of the Florence baptistry, eastern doors that they've been dubbed as a paradise, gates to paradise by Michelangelo. And then the north doors, they've been designed much later, in the middle of already 14th century by Lorenzo Ghiberti. But the south doors to the baptistry was designed by Andrea Pisano much earlier, sort of in the beginning of 14th century. And then on this door, we could see basically it's covered by these panels of different saints and virtues and so on. And the lower row of these panels are 3 cardinal virtues. And then on basically the bottom rightist panel depicting Prudence, exactly the figure we are after. So you could see here the women holding well, she doesn't hold a mirror itself, but she holds a snake, and in many ways she resembled the way how Prudence was depicted by Giotto in his frescoes. Again, we can see that there's no mirror here currently, but it's not impossible to exclude that she could be holding her left hand in such a position that she actually may hold a mirror. So you could see it's my bit of a Photoshop, but you could imagine this figure with a mirror too. But even without mirror, it's kind of interesting and classical representation of Prudence. Oh, she doesn't have any two heads. She has one head. Maybe interesting detail, she's sitting on cassona, which is I was also showing before, sort of the example of the chest, where women of this time were holding the dowry. However, if to follow the story, Andrea Pisano was also in charge of other works. As a himo workers or artists of his workshops were also in charge of some reliefs of the campanile, the belfry designed by Giotto himself, but some elements were designed by other architects or by other sculptors. And so you could see here this famous campanile. It's really literally mind-blowing building. You could actually climb up, and it's a fantastic view. But on the lower part of the buildings, you could see these reliefs. In this particular case, it's medallions, like more rhombic, like in a form of rhombs. 4 of them, they depicting the virtues of Christianity, and one of them depicting, of course, Prudence. Here we can see almost classical depiction of Prudence. It's a lady, it's a woman holding a mirror, holding a snake, and having a second head. So that's basically a default depiction of Prudence. It's not that easy to capture those images because it's a bit higher on campanile already, but fortunately we have almost identical version of that. It's basically replicas of those reliefs. They're in the museum of the cathedral, so you could see almost identically image of the Prudence from this reliefs. If I go back for a second to the doors by Andrea Pisano and to his south door, so we can see other example, other panel, which is kind of interesting. It's another woman. She's also sitting on this cassona. She is holding a cornucopia, but also kind of a strange object, which is not interpreted. It's not described in any way properly. You could interpret she's a charity, so it could be a heart or something. But if I compare this particular figure to the example of the coins of Providentia I showed you last time, it's almost identical. Back in Rome, this figure was holding cornucopia, and also kind of strange as a globe. Sometimes it's standing next to her, or sometimes she's holding it. Well, according to this tradition, this kind of artifacts, one of the tools of Providencia to forecast the future. However, if we go back to Florence of medieval times, it's become something she's holding, and it's becoming not Providentia but charity. So again, that's a very, very typical example of the shifting the meaning, shifting the attributes, and then reassigning the new meaning to the attributes taken from the past. So in my attempt to sort out the different attributes, I sort of designed this simple graphical tool that you could see here, the example of this Prudence by Andrea Pisano, or his workshop, and basically I can place the artwork itself, but also her key attributes. In this case, it's the 2 heads, the mirror, and the snakes. If we go back, we can see, for example, the same Prudence from the door. So she has a snake, but doesn't have a mirror, and she has 1 head. And as additional attributes, we can put this cassona. And if we compare it to the very first one by Giovanni di Balduccio, we can see, in this case, 3 heads, mirror, and a book. So we can compare different versions of this depictions. And the one I showed you also earlier from another one with the 3 heads, from the Met Museum in New York. She has 3 heads, but we cannot say anything about her any other attributes because they're not preserved. But what is known, at least, is this particular sculpture is attributed to the very famous Italian architects, actually also from Florence, so-called brother Bertini, Pazzo or Pacchio and Giovanni Bertini. They were trained in Florence, but although the majority of their work known are from Naples, when they worked for the local king and the nobility of the city. The next picture, for example, shows the very famous tomb of the King of Naples. This particular church was bombed during the Second World War, so it's not fully preserved. You could see some elements, but not completely. This is the picture from this particular tomb before the bombardment, and then also we can see here much better the figures of the virtues behind the king, and one of them is a Prudence holding actually a mirror and a book. I cannot say from this picture whether she has 1 head or 2 heads. And another one I showed you also earlier, this particular version, which is I've seen in Tifaf. Again, we can see that she has 3 heads, but no any other attributes. It is attributed to the sculpture known as Jacopo del Querce. Again, we don't have to see any attributes here, and with some fantasy we can either equip her with a mirror or with a snake. So it's up to us. Again, it's a funny Photoshop, but in principle it's not possible to exclude that she could have some other attributes as well. What confirms this actually attribution, actually we can betting that she could hold a snake, in fact, is because of the author of this sculpture. Jacopo del Querce was born not far from Siena and was working in this city much later. It's already kind of beginning of the 15th century. That's again a typical story. I've been to Siena. That's the very famous square of Siena Kappa. You could see here quite a famous fontaine called Gaia. But I didn't pay attention to the sculptures. I didn't notice any mirrors, for example, and I skipped them. Although by now I can understand that it's all the figures are representing virtues, and one of them is of course Prudence. She's holding snakes, and I think she's holding books, and I think she doesn't have any second head, at least according to the picture I have. As I said, this was basically kind of all the indications showing that the origin of this things was perhaps related to Florence. Kind of, if I follow before and after, it was not known before this time. I think Giovanni di Balduccio was the first one who coined it, and apparently it had some traction later on, for example, and it stays in art history for a while. For example, it is known much later, a very known painting by Titian, known as Prudence, and it's also very enigmatic. There are lots of versions what exactly is depicted here. We see here 3 figures, only in this case men, also of course 3 animals, and lots of versions what exactly symbolized by those, and so on, and so many hypotheses whether it's also self-portrait of Titian as well. But anyway, for me, it's interesting that this kind of topic, this kind of way of depicting Prudence actually existed. To complete this story, perhaps I have to go back to, if not to Milan, but to Pavia. Pavia is a small Italian town. It's actually not very far from Milan. I think it's about like maybe 15-20 kilometers south from Milan. What you see here is the church known as San Pietro del Soldore, St. Peter and Golden Skies. Again, not a very remarkable building from outside, or rather it's not very well preserved. But from inside it's actually still amazingly beautiful, with wonderful frescoes. But again, as typical, I'm interested in this tomb mainly. This is actually a very famous tomb or monument in Christianity. That's a tomb of St. Augustine, or Augustine, I don't exactly know how to pronounce it, Augustine of Hippo, very, very famous saint, or also father of Christian Church, known as Doctor of Church. He lived in 4th century, actually in what is now known as Algeria. So actually the whole project of bringing his relics, his remains into Pavia was quite an accomplishment. Well, nevertheless, it's also, as you see here, it's a magnificent tomb. Actually, it's bigger than the one in Milano. Clearly following the same pattern. We can see it's one layer higher than that, more complex, more figures, and so on. The actual author of this tomb is not known, although it's traditionally attributed to somebody from the school of, or somebody from the workshop of Giovanni di Balduccio. So in many, many ways it was influenced or impacted by Giovanni di Balduccio. In this particular case, we see here again the row of sculptures in the bottom that depicting the virtues and also saints, but it's not that easy to find the one I'm interested in. They're not in a frontal range. This is, for example, the side view, where on the right side you could see the example, you could see the indication where the Prudence is, and that's a picture of the rear side of the tomb, when in this case it's on your left side, you could see the figure of the Prudence. And this picture shows us exactly almost a replica of the one by Giovanni di Balduccio. A three-headed figure, again the young girl and woman and the old woman. Similar to the one by Giovanni di Balduccio, she also holds a mirror and a book. So it's, if we compare this to sort of infographics, it's basically identical depictions. To conclude, I could present this very, very looks like very complex infographic, although it's actually very simple. I took all the possible sort of cases of different figures of Prudence of this time, of this place. Basically, it's Italy, mainly sort of North Italy, and depicted them somewhat following the geographical and time sort of dimensions. What you could see here, the picture, so the way of depicting Prudence with 3 heads was coined by di Balduccio. At least I haven't seen anything earlier. And then after that, it's impacted number of sculptures. And then before that, what you see here, kind of my effort to directly go to his trainers, to Giovanni and Nicola Pisano, didn't go that far. I didn't find anything, but kind of as a sideways through Florence, and specifically to the school of Giotto, and brought more interesting examples of Prudence, which could be predecessors of the way of Giovanni di Balduccio. Well, as you could see here, there's basically a short story, really about certain, like almost vignette, a certain specific case. I didn't finally discover perhaps exact origin. I kind of spotted roughly, it's my hypothesis, that's kind of originated in a particular place, particular time. We can see there are lots of interesting leads going to Florence and Giotto specifically. So, well, Giotto looks like he kind of introduced mirrors, and then some of his followers, for example, Andrea Pisano, kind of introduced snake, perhaps, again, unless I discovered other examples, I can hold this hypothesis. And later on, Giovanni di Balduccio kind of added a 3-headed way of depicting Prudence. A small vignette, perhaps nothing kind of very remarkable, but all my experience showed that this sort of interesting ways to, interesting sort of sideways may eventually create a foundation for much later, much more interesting discoveries later on. So that's kind of it for today. So till the next stories in this Art Mirrors Futures. Maybe a kind of post-filmum instead of post-scriptum. Interestingly, it's maybe an interesting hint how to make the stories, long stories, look shorter. I can put the stories as a story and then add kind of post-scriptum. A small addition to the story I just told. I discovered much later, actually, by the end of the story already, when the film was sort of recorded, more or less. I found another example. In fact, I showed you this example of the Prudence already last time in the previous story. This particular relief, which is back then I found quite interesting and also strange. I didn't know the author of that relief. You could see here the Prudence with the snake and also mirror, in fact, and strangely I thought it will be like second head underneath her. But back then I didn't know who created this and where this takes place. And thanks to this story, I actually eventually found it. It's actually also in Florence. It is decorating so-called Loggia Lanzi. It's actually standing on this famous Piazza Signora, very famous place where, not far from Uffizi Gallery, kind of a epicenter of the city with lots of sculptures. And again, I've been there maybe not even once, but twice or even 3 times in this particular place. And for some reasons, I completely didn't pay attention to this particular decoration. It's on the upper row of this building. One of the relief depicting this this figure. It was created. Well, maybe worth kind of reminding that this is not a church. It actually was a secular building. It was eventually a kind of city hall. It was later allocated to the Landsknecht. That's why it's called Loggia Lanzi eventually. So we can see here there's 4 virtues, and one of them Prudence, and in this case it's actually in many ways resembles the one, the example of Giotto, with 2 heads and sort of the lady holding a mirror and a book. What is unusual, perhaps, is of course her wings. And now, if I look closer, I may actually see or spot kind of example of a second head. I cannot say it was a 100% confidence, but it looks like she has a second head. Therefore, altogether, she may have 3 heads, 2 of her own, and 1 is underneath, and that would be my depiction. So again, yet again, this additional things is basically adds extra weight to my story of Prudence, and specifically of this Florentine origin of the concept of 2 heads, and then eventually maybe 3 heads even. Itself, it's maybe just a kind of interesting nuance or vignette, but you never know how it will resonate in the future, which is basically I keep further exploring. What I've done, it's a very sort of modest exploration of, well, again, full of my personal discoveries, not necessarily objectively discovery for any professional. For example, lately I found this book written, it's only available in French. My translation would be Under the Gaze of Virtues, by Bertrand Cosnet. It's a kind of overview of depiction of virtue in Italian architecture. And then the author admits that he reviewed something like 1,300 works. So it's nothing comparable to my sort of very modest 20 or so works. I mean, I've seen more, but still it's very, very sort of preliminary and sort of very insignificant. Well, it's really sort of modest exploration of the works. Nevertheless, it was interesting for me. It just again confirms and it kind of triggers my curiosity what this fundamentally the blog is about. So now it's a final end until the next stories.